my insights on the Philippine-American War from the perspective of Filipinos. I'd like to begin with a quotation. It has been a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave. These were the words that were confidently uttered by John Hay, the American ambassador to Great Britain, to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, the future President of the United States, who had distinguished himself during the Spanish-American War. But if you were a Filipino who lived at the close of the 19th century, the experience was anything but splendid. America's war with Spain, brief as it was the prelude to a confluence of events that would bring to the United States conflict with the newly minted Philippine Republic. This war resulted in the deaths of 4,200 American servicemen and anywhere between 20 to 30,000 Filipino combatants. But the greatest tragedy was wrought on the civilian populace. Records from the U.S. State Department estimated the civilian death toll at approximately 250,000. Although Filipino historians believe it was double or even triple the conservative estimate. The heavy loss of life on the part of the Filipino civilians can be attributed to actions directly taken by the American Army, such as the destruction of property and agricultural crops, which led to severe food shortages, population displacement, torture, and the dreaded reconcentration. Diseases that regularly appear during times of war in the 19th and early 20th century, like malaria and typhoid, likewise caused deaths to soldiers and non-combatants. This culminated with a devastating outbreak of cholera in the final months of the war, killed 5,000 of Manila's inhabitants and anywhere between 100 to 200,000 people throughout the archipelago. The effects of America's war against the Filipinos was best captured in an excerpt of a speech delivered by Senator George Orr of Massachusetts, admonishing the so-called imperialists in the American government. He said, "You have devastated provinces. You have slain uncounted thousands of people you desire to benefit. You have established reconcentration camps. You have made the American flag in the eyes of a numerous people the emblem of sacrilege in Christian churches, and of the burning of human dwellings, and of the horror of water torture." For most Western scholars, the war, which began in February 1899, ended on July 1902, when President Theodore Roosevelt declared an amnesty and full pardon to all individuals in the Philippine archipelago who were involved in the conflict. This he did 2 days after the U.S. Secretary of War declared an end to the hostilities and the establishment of a civilian government. Some Filipino historians, however, disagree with this symbolic, politics-driven, unilateral declaration of the cessation of hostilities, as military actions conducted by Filipinos were still prevalent beyond 1902, even as far as 1913. They include Macario Sakay's military actions on behalf of the Tagalog Republic in 1903, the Tabal brothers of Cebu, whose attacks against the Americans and Cebuano elite collaborators would persist until 1906, the Pulahanes of Faustino Ablen's resistance movement against the Americans in Leyte from 1902 to 1907, his Negrense counterpart, Pope Dionisio Maguela or Papaisio, who was able to sustain a spirited military campaign in the island of Negros until his surrender in 1907, among others. The military campaign against Muslim Filipinos lasted even longer, as Tausug resistance to American rule would only be checked in 1913, and this was achieved by using brutal and inhumane tactics, which included massacres of women and children. Even Blackjack Pershing himself described in his memoirs, attacks were made materially reduced by a number and a practice that the army had already adopted, one that the Mohammedans held in abhorrence. The bodies were publicly buried in the same grave with a dead pig. The U.S. War Department and the newly established American civilian government in the Philippines would refer to post-July 1902 instances of armed resistance as merely acts perpetrated by disgruntled insurrectos, ladrones, bandits, and other lawless elements. Filipino historians, however, contest this assessment, believing that these examples of military actions, with the exception of the Moro Wars, were not only an extension of the armed resistance against the United States, albeit in a different form, but it was also part of the same strand, the continuation of the struggle for kalayaan, or independence, that Filipino revolutionaries had launched against Spain in 1896. How did Filipinos respond to the war with the United States? For the Filipino elites, their reaction to the conflict was seen in two ways. On one hand, some of the economic and landed elites and local caciques saw the war as an opportunity to advance their economic interests and to secure their privileged position in Philippine society by aligning with the Americans, or at the very least, to be conciliatory towards them, as their self-serving goals could also be achieved by collaborating with American military and civil government officials. They also include Manila-based Filipino elites, sometimes referred to as autonomistas, who favored autonomous government under an American protectorate. They would subsequently form the Partido Federalista in 1900, who not only came out openly for peace and acceptance of American rule, but also expressed the desire for the Philippines to be admitted as one of the states of the Union. Filipino revolutionaries both ridiculed and scorned autonomists like Pedro Paterno, Trinidad Pablo de Tavera, Benito Legarda, and Felipe Camino, often using pejorative terms like opportunists, cowards, and traitors. While it is true that some elite Filipino intellectuals and other Filipino landowners and men in the provinces collaborated with the Americans, the principal leaders of the resistance against the Americans were men of the same type. Emilio Aguinaldo, for instance, was a cacique landowner. Antonio Luna and Jose Alejandrino were prominent ilustrados and contemporaries of Jose Rizal before they became generals in the Revolutionary Army. This tragic lack of unity of purpose among the Filipino elites, half sympathetic and the other half actively resisting the United States, made it easier for America's military and civil authorities to successfully implement policies like William Howard Taft's policy of attraction to win over the Filipino population, thus depriving the Revolutionary Army logistical and mass-based support. On the part of ordinary Christian lowland Filipinos, their response to the conflict likewise varied. In Luzon, a considerable number of the participants of the military campaign against the United States were social revolutionaries. Others participated out of patron-client or landlord sharecropper obligations. Still others were members of militarian groups who sought to free themselves from colonial expression and exploitation, initially from the Spaniards and subsequently from the Americans, though their notion of liberation was more aligned with spiritual freedom and genuine social equality or brotherhood, instead of modern concepts like political independence. For Muslim Filipinos, their resistance to the Americans formally began when the United States sent troops to Jolo to enforce the Treaty of Paris. Initially, There was no direct conflict as the American military commanders who were initially assigned to administer the Department of Mindanao Hulong adopted friendly and conciliatory policies with the Moros. That would, however, prove to be short-lived, as the fragile peace was soon broken in the first quarter of 1902 by small-scale Moro attacks on American troops. These attacks were focused on American troops stationed south of Lake Lanao. This prompted the American military to launch several punitive expeditions to crush the centers of Moro resistance. In the years that followed, several pitched battles and campaigns were fought, including the battles of Pandapatan in Lanao del Sur, Siranaya in the Cotabato Valley, the first and second battles of Buddahu, and culminating with the Battle of Budsak, the last major battle in the Moro Rebellion. There were also Filipino communities like the Lumads of Mindanao and the Cordillera peoples of northern Luzon. The term Lumad, which in Cebuano means indigenous, refers to the inhabitants of the Mindanao Island who had neither been converted to Islam nor Christianity. As such, they were able to retain their animist beliefs and traditions. For the Lumads, intercommunal violence between their communities and American forces became evident when their ancestral lands were targeted with forced annexation by the American military and the Philippine civilian colonial government. These actions legitimized their grievances in fighting for the self-determination of their communities. I would like to end this brief overview by saying that unlike in other revolutionary movements, where there is a homogeneity on purpose, a clear top-down understanding of goals and objectives, the Philippine experience was much more diverse. With the capture of Aguinaldo and the absence of a reliable means of communicating and coordinating the revolutionary forces scattered throughout the archipelago, Filipino resistance was confined along provincial, regional, and ethno-linguistic lines. Nonetheless, all fall under an overarching theme that both Filipinos and Americans who fought in wars of liberation can appreciate: the collective desire to be free from foreign domination. Thank you.